What would you do if you discovered the person you were trying to save had every reason to hate you, Jake? Morrison thought he'd left his past behind when he walked away from the cavalry. But when he found a terrified Apache woman hiding in his barn, clutching a notebook filled with secrets, he had no idea his own name was written in those pages. This is a story about guilt that won't stay buried, truth that demands to be heard, and two broken people who discovered that redemption isn't about forgetting the past, it's about facing it together. If you love tales of courage, unexpected alliances, and love that grows from the hardest soil hit, that like button, subscribe, and let's begin. Your name is in here. Former Scout protects silent witness who learns that he's part of what broke her. The barn door shouldn't have been open. Jake Morrison knew this the moment he rode up to his ranch in the fading Montana twilight. 3 years of living alone had made him careful about details like that. The door was always secured, always latched against wind and wandering animals. But tonight it hung ajar, swaying slightly in the October breeze that carried the smell of coming snow. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle. Old habits from cavalry days, the kind that kept you breathing when others didn't make it home. He dismounted slowly, boots touching earth without sound, every sense suddenly sharp and focused. The land around his small ranch stretched wide and empty, rolling grassland that met distant mountains where the last sunlight painted the peaks in shades of copper and gold. Beautiful country, lonely country, the kind of place a man came to when he wanted to be forgotten. Jake had chosen this isolation deliberately after walking away from his cavalry unit in 1881. After Wounded Knee, after too many orders that sat wrong in his gut and too many faces he couldn't unsee when he closed his eyes at night. He approached the barn with the rifle ready but not raised, threatening, not aggressive, a careful balance he'd learned over hard years. Inside the barn was darker than the deepening dusk outside. His eyes needed a moment to adjust to separate shadow from substance. The two horses in their stalls shifted nervously, ears forward, in alert. They sensed something wrong. Then he saw her, a figure huddled in the corner between stacked hay bales and the far wall, small and utterly still. For a heartbeat, Jake thought it might be a child, but then she moved slightly and he saw the lean frame of an adult woman compressed into the smallest possible space. Dark eyes watched him from beneath tangled black hair. Not pleading, not terrified, just measuring, calculating whether he represented safety or another threat in a long line of threats. Jake recognized that look. He'd seen it on the faces of prisoners during the Indian campaigns, people who had learned that survival meant being invisible, that speaking invited violence, that the only safety was in silence and stillness. His throat tightened. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, lowering the rifle completely. The woman didn't respond, didn't move. Her breathing was so controlled it was barely visible. Jake took a slow step back, giving her space. "You're safe here. I promise, Bruce." Still nothing. He could see her more clearly now as his eyes fully adjusted. Apache, he thought, though he'd learned the hard way that tribal identification from appearance alone was often wrong and always reductive. She wore what looked like the remains of a cotton dress torn at the hem and stained with travel. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been something else. No shoes. She'd been running hard and running long. On the ground beside her, clutched in one hand with a grip that suggested she'd die before letting go, was a small leather-bound notebook. Jake's military training warred with something newer, something he'd been trying to cultivate since leaving the service. The soldier in him cataloged threats and assessed tactical situations. The man he was trying to become saw only another human being in desperate need. The man won. "There's a cabin about 50 yards that way," he said, gesturing toward the door without making any move toward her. "It's warm. There's food, a bed. You can stay there tonight, or longer, your choice." He paused, then added the words that felt most important. "No one will make you do anything you don't want to do." Her eyes narrowed slightly, evaluating, testing for deception. Jake did the only thing he could think of. He turned his back on her, a gesture of trust that went against every tactical instinct he possessed, and walked out of the barn. Outside, he stood at the gathering darkness and waited. The mountains had gone purple and black against the sky, turning the deep blue that came just before full night. Stars were beginning to pierce through cold and distant. He heard her before he saw her, the softest whisper of movement footsteps so light they barely disturbed the dust. When he glanced back, she was standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the darker interior, still holding that notebook. "The cabin," Jake said simply and started walking. After a long moment, she followed, far enough back that she could run if needed, close enough that he knew she'd made a choice. Inside the cabin, Jake moved carefully, aware of her, watching his every action. He lit the oil lamp on the rough wooden table, then stepped away so she could see the whole space. One room, simple. A bed in the corner, a small stove, shelves with supplies. No hidden areas, no locked doors, no traps. The woman stood near the entrance, positioned so she could bolt if necessary. Her eyes tracked everything: the rifle he leaned against the wall, far from where she stood, the windows, the back door, the contents of the shelves, looking for weapons, looking for exits, looking for evidence of what kind of man he was. Jake had the sudden, unsettling thought that she was far better at this kind of assessment than he'd ever been. This wasn't paranoia. This was expertise born of brutal necessity. "I'm Jake," he offered. "Jake Morrison." Silence. "You don't have to tell me your name," he continued. "You don't have to tell me anything. But if you're hungry, there's dried venison and bread, water in that pitcher." He moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, keeping his movements slow and visible, non-threatening. Behind him, he heard the softest sound, the creak of a floorboard as she shifted weight. Then carefully, the sound of her lowering herself into the chair farthest from him. Progress. They stayed like that for a long time, Jake working at the stove while she sat in charged silence. He made coffee, cut bread, laid out dried meat and a precious half-wheel of cheese he'd been saving. Put it all on the table between them. Then he took his own plate and cup and moved to sit on the porch step outside, leaving her alone with the food. Through the open door, he heard her move. The sounds of someone eating quickly, but not desperately, controlled even in hunger. He sipped his coffee and watched the stars multiply across the vast Montana sky and tried not to think too hard about how this woman had ended up in his barn. Tried not to think about all the reasons an Apache woman might be running alone through frontier territory. Tried not to think about his own part in creating a world where that was necessary. When he finally came back inside, she'd finished eating and retreated to the far corner. But her posture had shifted slightly, less compressed. The notebook still clutched to her chest, but her breathing was deeper now. The breathing of someone who might be starting to believe she could rest. "You can have the bed," Jake said. "I'll sleep in the barn." Her eyes widened fractionally, the first real reaction he'd seen. "It's fine," he assured her. "Warmer than most places I slept during cavalry days." He grabbed a blanket from the shelf. "There's a bolt on the inside of that door. Use it. I won't try to come in until morning." He was halfway to the door when she spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but the single word stopped him in his tracks. "Why?" Jake turned back slowly. She was watching him with an intensity that felt like being examined under harsh light. Those dark eyes demanded truth, would accept nothing less. "Because someone should have done this for you a long time ago," he said simply. "And no one did." Something flickered across her face. Too quick to name. Pain maybe, or recognition. She gave the smallest nod and Jake stepped out into the night. In the barn, wrapped in his blanket with his rifle within reach and his horses settled. Jake stared at the darkness and wondered what he'd just invited into his carefully isolated life. A fugitive, clearly. Running from something or someone with enough determination to strip her down to nothing but will and that mysterious notebook. But from what? From whom? And why did looking into her eyes make him feel like he was staring at the consequences of every choice he'd made in his cavalry years? Sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did, Jake's dreams were filled with faces he'd been trying to forget. Apache families displaced by cavalry escorts. Survey teams he'd protected while they mapped land that didn't belong to them. Orders followed without question because that's what soldiers did. He woke before dawn with the sick certainty that whatever this woman was running from it was connected to the very system he'd served. And that somehow, in ways he didn't yet understand, he might be part of why she was running. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Jake approached the cabin. He knocked softly, announcing himself before trying the door. It was unbolted. Inside, he found her kneeling by the window, the notebook spread open on the sill. She was writing something in careful, precise script. When she heard him enter, she closed it quickly, but didn't hide it. A small gesture of trust, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement that hiding was pointless now. In the morning light, Jake could see her more clearly. Younger than he'd first thought, late 20s maybe. High cheekbones and strong features that spoke of heritage and dignity no amount of hardship could erase. But it was her hands that caught his attention. When she reached for the cup of water on the table, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing her wrist. There, faint but unmistakable in the pale morning light, was a small scar shaped like a five-pointed star. Jake's blood went cold. He'd seen that mark before, years ago during the campaigns. It was a brand used by some cavalry units to mark prisoners deemed flight risks, burned into flesh with heated metal as casually as ranchers branded cattle. He'd watched it done, had stood silent while men under his command, under his protection, inflicted that permanent mark on people whose only crime was defending their own land. The woman saw him staring at her wrist, saw the recognition in his eyes. She pulled her sleeve down slowly, deliberately, and met his gaze with a challenge that needed no words. You know what this means. You know what was done to me. The question is, what kind of man are you now? Jake forced himself to breathe. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. I was cavalry, 3rd Regiment, Montana Territory. Served from 74 to 81. He paused, the confession bitter in his mouth. I left because I couldn't keep following orders that felt wrong. She watched him without expression. I don't know if I ever gave that order, Jake continued. To mark someone like that, I'd like to think I didn't, but I was there. I was part of it. And if you want me to leave you alone, if you want to take supplies and go, I'll understand. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with that unnerving intensity. Then she did something unexpected. She opened the notebook again, found a specific page, turned it so he could see. It was a map, detailed, professional, showing the Montana Territory with annotations in what looked like surveyor's shorthand. Routes marked, dates noted, and in the margins, lists of names. Jake recognized some of them. Wealthy ranchers, territorial officials, men of power and influence. And there, about halfway down one list, his stomach dropped as he saw it. His own name, J. Morrison, 3rd Cavalry. Escort, June 1876. The woman's voice was stronger now, though still quiet. You were there. You escorted Edmund Whitmore's survey team through tribal lands near the Wyoming border. Jake's mind raced backward. June 1876, 7 years ago. He'd done dozens of escort missions, protected survey teams, railroad scouts, mining operations, all in the name of progress and development. All he now understood in the name of theft. I don't remember. He admitted the words, feeling like a betrayal. There were so many. I remember, she said, and in those 2 words Jake heard a world of pain. She turned more pages, each one revealing more evidence. Survey maps that didn't match official land claims. Notes about water rights being transferred illegally. Dates when families were displaced and dates when new land patents were filed, always suspiciously close together. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a documented case of systematic land fraud spanning years. How did you get all this? Jake asked. I worked for Whitmore, she said, and there was something sharp in her voice now, something like satisfaction at seeing Jake's shock. He thought I was too stupid to read, too worthless to pay attention to. He talked in front of me like I was furniture. She flipped to another page, a sketch of a man's face rendered in quick but skillful strokes. Even from the drawing, Jake could see the cruelty in the set of the mouth, the coldness in the eyes. Edmund Whitmore, she confirmed. He orchestrated land seizures across 3 territories, used falsified surveys to claim that tribal lands were actually public domain, then bought them through proxies before the real owners even knew they'd been dispossessed. That's, Jake struggled for words. That's massive fraud. That's just the beginning, she interrupted. Her hand moved to a specific page, and Jake saw her fingers tremble slightly before she steadied them. The page showed a different kind of notation. Dates, locations, and one name written larger than the others. Chief Tahatan, assassinated June 7th, 1876. My father, she said quietly. The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind with sickening clarity. June 1876. The escort mission he couldn't quite remember. And now this evidence that during that mission, someone had orchestrated murder. Whitmore didn't just steal land, the woman continued. Her voice remained controlled, but Jake could hear the weight behind each word. He eliminated anyone with enough influence to challenge him. My father was a chief. He had relationships with territorial officials, could read and write English, knew how to navigate your legal system. He was dangerous to Whitmore's operation. She turned another page. More notes, more documentation. Whitmore hired mercenaries, dressed them in cavalry uniforms, used your escort as cover. When you were camped for the night, they rode out and killed my father and two of his advisors. Made it look like a random attack by hostile forces. Jake felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. I didn't know. We were told to provide protection for surveyors. That was all. We never. I know, she said, and there was something in her tone that might have been mercy, might have been exhaustion. You didn't pull the trigger, but your presence made it possible. Your uniform gave them legitimacy. Your protection allowed Whitmore to move freely through our lands. She closed the notebook and met his eyes directly. My name is Ayana, she said. It means eternal bloom. My father gave it to me because he said I was born during the first flowers of spring. Her jaw tightened. Edmund Whitmore destroyed those flowers, burned the ground they grew in, and salted the earth so nothing could grow again. And then he branded me like an animal and sold me to a rancher who used me until I found a way to escape. The morning sun streaming through the window seemed too bright, too cheerful for the darkness of what she was describing. I've been running for 2 years, Ayana continued, gathering evidence, documenting everything. Because someone has to tell the truth about what was done. Someone has to make them answer for it. Jake sank into the chair across from her, his legs suddenly unsteady. Why did you come here to my ranch specifically? For the first time, something that might have been a smile ghosted across Ayana's face. I didn't plan to. I escaped from a transport 3 days ago. They were taking me to an auction in Helena. I jumped from the wagon and ran. Your barn was the first shelter I found. The auction, Jake said slowly, remembering. I was supposed to go yesterday, to buy horses. Then Providence is strange, Ayana said. Because if you'd gone, you might have bought me from him, and then you'd have found my name in a ledger instead of finding me in your barn. The absurdity and horror of it struck Jake simultaneously. He could have purchased her, could have participated in the exact kind of dehumanizing transaction that had enabled all of this brutality. Instead, she'd come to him, carrying proof of his complicity and her suffering. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Ayana studied him for a long moment. There's a territorial marshal in Helena, Owen Blackwell. He has a reputation for being honest, which out here is rare enough to be remarkable. If I could get this evidence to him, if I could testify, they'd kill you before you made it halfway to Helena, Jake said. I know. Her voice was matter-of-fact. That's why I need help. Why would you trust me? The question burst out before Jake could stop it. My name is in that book. I'm part of what broke you. Ayana set the notebook down carefully on the table between them. Because you left, she said simply. Because you came back here and hid yourself away instead of continuing to profit from what you'd done. Because when you found me in your barn, you didn't demand answers or assert authority. You offered safety. She paused, then added, and because I watched you all night through the barn window. I saw you sitting there staring at nothing, looking exactly like someone who carries ghosts he can't put down. I recognize that look. I see it in my reflection every morning. Jake realized she'd never actually slept last night. She'd watched him, assessed him, made her decision based on observation, not desperation. You're remarkable, he said without thinking. I'm exhausted, Ayana corrected. I'm hunted, and I'm running out of options. She touched the notebook. But I have this, and now I have you, if you're willing. Jake thought about the life he'd built in these 3 years of isolation. Simple, quiet, free from the complications of the wider world and the weight of past mistakes. He could send Ayana away with supplies and directions, could give her money and wish her luck, could retreat back into his carefully constructed solitude, could continue to hide from the consequences of what he'd been part of. Or he could do what he should have done 7 years ago. Stand up, speak out, use whatever privilege and position he had to support someone demanding justice. The choice when he made it felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I'll help you," Jake said. "Whatever it takes. We'll get you to Marshal Blackwell. We'll make sure your evidence is heard." Ayanna's shoulders dropped slightly, releasing tension she'd been carrying so long it had become part of her posture. "Thank you," she whispered. And Jake saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. The acknowledgement that she'd made the right gamble, chosen the right ally, stood the right person. It made him more determined than ever not to betray that trust. They spent the rest of the morning planning. Ayanna showed Jake more of her documentation, walking him through the evidence she'd compiled. The scope of Whitmore's conspiracy was staggering. Dozens of families displaced, thousands of acres stolen, millions of dollars in fraudulent land patents, and all of it protected by a network of corrupt officials, paid enforcers, and legal mechanisms designed to make resistance impossible. "Helena is 3 days' ride north," Jake said, studying the maps. "But if they're looking for you, and they will be, they'll watch the main roads." "I know the backcountry," Ayanna said. She pulled out a hand-drawn map of her own, showing trails and passes Jake had never heard of. "There's a route through the high country, harder, takes longer, but less likely to be watched." "How do you know this territory so well?" "My father taught me," Ayanna said softly. "Before the cavalry came, before the surveyors, before people like Whitmore decided our land was worth more without us on it. My father taught me to read the earth like you read books. Every stream, every pass, every sheltered valley. He said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't take from us." She touched the notebook, almost absently. "He was wrong. They took everything but the knowledge and that I kept." Jake heard the pain beneath her words and recognized it. Different sources, different experiences, but the same fundamental wound. They'd both served systems that had broken them in different ways. "We'll need supplies," he said, forcing himself to focus on practical matters. "Weapons, food for at least a week in case we have to avoid settlements." "There's something else," Ayanna said. She hesitated, then continued. "Whitmore has a tracker. Silas Cord. He's the best in the territory. If they've realized I'm gone, and they have, Silas will be hunting me." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Silas Cord, his former partner, his closest friend during his cavalry years, the man who'd saved his life twice and whose life Jake had saved 3 times. They'd been closer than brothers, bound by the kind of trust that only forms when you face death together repeatedly. Silas had begged Jake not to leave the cavalry, had argued that walking away was betrayal. They'd parted badly with words spoken in anger that neither could take back. And now Silas was hunting the woman Jake had just sworn to protect. "You know him," Ayanna said, reading Jake's expression with that unnerving accuracy. "We served together," Jake admitted. Yes, he's very good at what he does." "Will he kill you to get to me?" The question was blunt, pragmatic. It deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," Jake said. 3 years ago, I would have said no. Now, I don't know what Silas has become, or what he thinks I've become." Ayanna nodded slowly. "Then we assume he's a threat. We plan accordingly." Her ability to compartmentalize, to set aside emotion and focus on survival was both impressive and heartbreaking. She'd learned these skills through necessity, through years of having to be smarter and more prepared than everyone hunting her. "There's one more thing," Jake said. He pulled out his own maps, older cavalry survey maps he'd kept. "I have contacts, people who owe me favors from my service days, good people who got out like I did. If we can reach—" A sound outside cut him off. Horses, multiple riders approaching fast. Jake and Ayanna moved simultaneously, he toward his rifle, she toward the back window. They'd both developed the same survival instincts, the same immediate response to unexpected danger. Through the front window, Jake saw them. 5 men on horseback riding hard toward the cabin. At the front, tall and unmistakable, even at this distance, was a figure Jake recognized instantly. Silas Cord. "The barn," Jake said urgently. "There's a loose board in the back stall. Leads to a crawl space under the floor. Hide there, don't come out until I give the all clear." Ayanna grabbed her notebook and moved toward the back door, then paused. If he knows I'm here, then I'll delay him, Jake interrupted. Go now, and she met his eyes for one charged moment, and Jake saw the calculation happening behind her gaze, weighing whether to trust him, whether this was betrayal or protection. Then she ran. Jake watched her disappear into the barn, then turned to face his past, riding up to his door. Silas Cord dismounted with the easy grace of a man utterly comfortable in his own capability. He was older than Jake remembered, more weathered, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes was unchanged. He wore trail dust and hard travel, and the rifle slung across his back was the same weapon he'd carried during their cavalry days. Behind him, the four other men fanned out in a loose perimeter. Professional, tactical. They'd done this before. Jake Morrison, Silas said, and his voice carried both greeting and challenge. Been a long time, brother. Silas? Jake kept his voice neutral. Didn't expect to see you out this way. I'm working, Silas said. He took a few steps closer, eyes scanning the cabin, the yard, the barn, reading everything. Tracking a fugitive. Apache woman, late 20s, carrying stolen property. You seen anyone like that? Jake felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He could lie, could claim ignorance and send Silas away. But Silas would know. They'd served together too long. Silas could read him as well as Ayanna could. Why are you doing this, Silas? Jake asked instead. Since when do you hunt people for men like Whitmore? Silas's expression hardened. Since I decided to live in the real world instead of hiding from it like some coward. The words hit like a slap. That woman stole valuable documents. Property crime. I'm bringing her back to face justice. Justice, Jake repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling it now? Don't, Silas warned. Don't start with your righteousness. You walked away, Jake. You left us, left me, left everything we built together. You don't get to judge how the rest of us survive. I left because I couldn't stomach what we were becoming, Jake shot back, because I realized we were on the wrong side. There are no sides, Silas said. There's only civilization and chaos, progress and savagery. We served on the side that builds things. That creates order. I'm still serving that cause. By hunting a woman whose only crime is telling the truth. Silas's face went cold. Oh, so she is here. Jake realized his mistake too late. He'd confirmed Ayanna's presence without meaning to. Silas smiled, and it was not a kind expression. I don't want to hurt you, Jake. We're brothers. But I will go through you if I have to. Silas gestured to his men. Search the property. No. Jake's hand moved to his rifle. Not threatening yet, but ready. The four men behind Silas reached for their weapons. The morning air suddenly felt brittle with potential violence. You'd die for her, Silas asked, genuine confusion in his voice. For some Indian woman you just met, after everything we survived together, everything we meant to each other, you'd throw that away for a stranger. She's not a stranger, Jake said quietly. She's a person, a human being who deserves protection and justice, the kind we swore to provide when we took our oaths. Or did you forget those words? I remember the words, Silas said. I also remember the reality. The world is harsh, Jake. It always has been. The strong survive. The weak get swept aside. That's not cruelty. That's nature. What happened to you? Jake asked, and he heard genuine grief in his own voice. You used to believe in things, honor, duty, protection of the innocent. I believed in us, Silas corrected, in our brotherhood, and you destroyed that when you walked away. For a moment, Jake saw past the hardness to the hurt beneath. Silas wasn't just angry, he was wounded. Jake's departure had felt like abandonment, like rejection of everything they'd shared. But that didn't make what Silas was doing now right. I'm sorry I hurt you, Jake said. I truly am. But I can't let you take her. She has evidence of crimes that need to be exposed. People who need to answer for what they've done. People like you, Silas asked softly. Your name is in those documents too, Jake. If she takes this to a marshal, if she testifies, you'll be implicated alongside everyone else. Did you think about that? Jake had thought about it. All morning while Ayanna had shown him page after page of evidence, he'd been aware that his own name appeared throughout. that seeking justice for her crimes might mean facing consequences for his own complicity. I've thought about it, he admitted, and I'm willing to face whatever comes. If justice means accountability for everyone, including me, then so be it. Silas stared at him like he was a stranger. You really have changed. Yeah, Jake said, I have. For a long, tense moment, the two former partners faced each other across the dusty yard. Years of shared history of trust and brotherhood and battles survived together, all balanced against fundamentally incompatible choices about who they'd become. Then Silas shook his head. I'll give you 1 day, he said finally. 1 day head start. After that, I'm coming after you both. And next time, our history won't stop me from doing my job. He turned and swung back into his saddle. His men followed suit, confused but obedient. Why, Jake asked. Why give us a head start? Silas looked down at him from the horseback, and for just a moment, Jake saw his old friend behind the hard mask. Because once a long time ago, you pulled me out of a river when I'd been shot and left for dead. You carried me 12 miles to the nearest fort. I never forgot that. He pulled his horse around. 1 day, Jake, then I fulfill my contract. And if you're still with her, I will go through you. The riders disappeared over the ridge, leaving dust and implications hanging in the air. Jake stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. Silas had given them a gift. 1 day, 24 hours to get as far ahead as possible. It was more mercy than Jake had expected, and far less time than they needed. He's gone, Jake called toward the barn. Ayanna emerged from a hidden space notebook clutched to her chest, dust in her hair. She'd heard everything. Your friend, she said. Former friend, Jake corrected. He'll keep his word about the day. Yes, Silas has many faults, but he doesn't lie about things like that. Ayanna nodded slowly. Then we leave now. Gather what we can carry and go. They worked quickly, efficiently. Jake pulled together supplies, dried food, ammunition, blankets, medical kit. Ayanna helped saddle the horses with practiced hands that spoke of more experience than most people ever gained. Within an hour, they were ready to ride. Jake took one last look at his cabin, his carefully constructed refuge from the world. 3 years he'd lived here. 3 years of peace and isolation, and attempted redemption through withdrawal. Now he was abandoning it for something far more dangerous and far more meaningful. Active redemption. Redemption through action rather than avoidance. Are you sure? Ayanna asked quietly. You can still walk away. Give me supplies and directions. Save yourself. Jake swung into his saddle. I'm sure. Even though my quest for justice might destroy you too. Especially because of that, Jake said. I've been hiding from consequences long enough. Time to face them. Ayanna mounted her horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle like she belonged there. She looked at Jake with an expression he was learning to read, respect mixed with wariness, gratitude tempered by hard-learned caution. Then we ride for Helene, she said, and we trust that truth is worth the price we'll pay for it. They turned their horses north and rode into the Montana wilderness, leaving behind safety and certainty for the dangerous path toward justice. Behind them, Jake's isolated ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead, the mountains rose like a promise and a threat. And somewhere in between, Silas Cord's clock was already ticking down. 1 day, 24 hours. Then the hunt would begin in earnest. The high country was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Jake and Ayanna rode through passes where the October cold bit through layers of clothing and the air grew thin enough to make breathing an effort. The trail Ayanna followed wasn't really a trail at all, more a suggestion of passage through country most people would consider impassable. But she navigated it with certainty, reading the landscape like Jake read words on a page. Your father taught you this route, Jake asked during one of their brief rest stops. Ayanna nodded, running her hand along her horse's neck with gentle affection. Among others, he believed we should know every path, every hidden valley, every water source. He said our knowledge of the land was power that couldn't be taken by force. She paused, pain flickering across her features. He was wrong about that, but the knowledge itself, that stayed true. They'd been riding for 6 hours and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Soon they'd need to find shelter for the night. The temperature was already dropping, and at this altitude, nighttime could be deadly without proper protection. There's a cave system about 2 miles ahead, Ayanna said, as if reading his thoughts. Natural shelter. Defensible. My father and I camped there once when I was young. Jake noticed she talked about her father more now. Small details? Memories. As though speaking them aloud kept him alive in some way. They reached the caves as the last light was fading from the sky. The entrance was partially hidden by a rockfall invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the main chamber was large enough for the horses and had evidence of previous occupation. Old fire rings sheltered areas smoothed by long-ago use. This was a traditional camping ground, Ayana explained as she began unpacking supplies. Before the territories were divided and claimed, before people needed permission to exist in the places they'd always been. There was no bitterness in her voice, just statement of fact. The world had changed, and not for the better, and no amount of anger would undo it. Jake built a small fire while Ayana tended the horses. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that had developed surprisingly quickly between them. The silence of people who understood each other's need for quiet. As they ate their sparse meal of dried venison and hardtack, Jake found himself studying Ayana in the firelight. She'd changed in subtle ways since yesterday morning, shoulders less hunched, movements less constrained, as though each mile from her captors allowed her to reclaim a little more of herself. "Can I ask you something?" he ventured. Ayana looked up from her notebook where she'd been reviewing maps. "You can ask. Why didn't you destroy the evidence if it's this dangerous to carry, if it makes you this valuable to hunt? Why not burn it and disappear?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the rocks with a sound like distant voices. "Because without it, I'm just another Indian woman with a story no one will believe," she finally said. "With it, I have proof, I have power, I have the ability to make them face what they've done." She touched the notebook almost reverently. "This isn't just about land or money or even my father's death. It's about proving that we matter, that our lives and our losses are real and documented and cannot be dismissed as exaggeration or lies." Jake understood then. The notebook was more than evidence. It was validation, proof of existence and worth in a system designed to erase both. "When we get to Helena," he said carefully, "when we present this to Marshal Blackwell, you know it won't be easy. They'll attack your credibility, question everything, make you relive the worst moments over and over." "I know," Ayana said. "I've been preparing for that for 2 years. Every moment I've survived, every hardship I've endured has been preparation for the moment I get to stand in front of people with power and force them to listen." She looked at Jake directly. "You can't understand what it means. To be constantly told you're worthless, that your words don't matter, that you're less than human. And then to have evidence, irrefutable, documented evidence that proves they're wrong. That you are valuable precisely because you know the truth." Jake thought about his own years of service following orders without question. Never speaking up, never challenging the system even when it felt wrong. "I think I understand a little," he said quietly. "I spent years being told that what we were doing was right and necessary. That progress required sacrifice and the people being sacrificed didn't really matter. I never questioned it, never demanded proof, just believed." "And now," Ayana asked, "now I can't stop questioning everything. Every choice I made, every order I followed, every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken." "Good," Ayana said firmly. "Questioning is the first step toward changing." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thoughts of past and future guilt and redemption, the weight of truth and the cost of seeking justice. Finally, Jake asked the question that had been troubling him all day. "You heard what Silas said about my name being in the documents, about me being implicated if you testify." "I heard. Does it bother you that helping you might destroy me?" Ayana met his eyes without flinching. "Does it bother you?" I asked first. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Yes, you did." She considered her answer carefully. "It would bother me if you were still the man who escorted Whitmore in 1876. But you're not. You've changed, you left. And now you're risking everything to help me seek justice, even knowing it might implicate you." She paused. That transformation matters. Not just to me, but to the truth itself. Because if even one person who is part of the system can change, can choose different, can stand up against what they once served, then change is possible. And that's almost as important as justice. Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that and hadn't asked for it, but perhaps acknowledgement that redemption was possible if you were willing to face consequences. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Ayana replied. We still have to survive the next few days. She was right. Gratitude was premature. They had miles to go and dangers to face before any of this mattered. Tell me about Silas, Ayana said, changing the subject with characteristic directness. How did you two become so close? Jake leaned back against the cave wall, remembering. We met during training. He was from Georgia, I was from Ohio. We were both young and stupid and absolutely certain we were going to change the world. What changed? Everything, nothing. We saw combat together. Survived things that should have killed us. You create bonds like that. They're supposed to last forever. But they didn't. No, because we were building that bond while doing things that I eventually couldn't justify. Escorting surveyors who were stealing land, protecting railroad crews who were cutting through sacred sites, following orders to move people off their own land at gunpoint. Jake's hands clenched unconsciously. Silas saw all the same things I did. But where I felt guilt, he felt righteousness. He truly believed we were on the right side, building civilization, creating order from chaos. And you stopped believing that. Wounded Knee broke me, Jake said bluntly. We weren't there, but we heard about it. 300 people dead, most of them women and children, and the officers involved were called heroes, given medals. He looked at Ayana. That's when I realized the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and I couldn't be part of it anymore. How did Silas react when you told him you were leaving? Badly. He said I was betraying everything we'd fought for, everyone who died beside us. He said walking away made their deaths meaningless. Jake's voice dropped. He might have been right about that. I don't know. But I knew I couldn't stay. Couldn't keep being part of something that treated human beings as obstacles to progress. Ayana was quiet for a moment. He loved you, she finally said. As a brother. Maybe more than a brother. And you leaving felt like you were choosing strangers over him. How do you know that? Because I saw his face this morning. The way he looked at you. Ayana's expression was thoughtful. He wasn't just angry about the trauma or the delay. He was hurt. Deeply. The kind of hurt that only comes from betrayal by someone you truly loved. Jake hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been so focused on his own guilt and Silas's anger that he hadn't considered the grief beneath. That actually makes it worse, he said. If he's hunting us out of personal pain rather than professional obligation, he'll be more dangerous, Ayana finished, more determined, less likely to show mercy a second time. Yes, they both understood the implications. Tomorrow Silas's promised day would be up. The hunt would resume in earnest, and this time old friendship wouldn't be enough to save them. We should sleep, Ayana said. Dawn comes early in the mountains. She moved to arrange her bedroll on the far side of the fire. The positioning was deliberate, close enough for warmth and safety, far enough to maintain clear boundaries. Trust had limits, even trust forged in shared danger. Jake settled into his own blanket's rifle within easy reach. I'll take first watch. No need, Ayana said. I'll know if anyone approaches. I'm a light sleeper. So am I. We'll trade off in 4-hour shifts. Ayana looked like she might argue, then nodded. Another small gesture of trust, allowing herself to rely on someone else, even slightly, even temporarily. Jake watched the fire and listened to the mountain wind and thought about tomorrow, about Silas hunting them, about the long ride still ahead, about the slim chance they'd actually make it to Helena alive, about the woman sleeping across the fire who carried the weight of truth in a leather notebook and refused to let go no matter the cost. Somewhere in the 3rd hour of his watch, Jake heard Ayana cry out softly in her sleep. Not a scream, just a small sound of distress. He started to move toward her, then stopped. She was dreaming, reliving something, and the last thing she'd want was to be woken by a man looming over her. Instead, Jake spoke quietly. Ayana, you're safe. It's just a dream. The sound of his voice seemed to reach her. Her breathing steadied. The tension in her posture eased. And Jake realized something that both terrified and humbled him. She trusted his voice, even in sleep, even in the grip of nightmares. He'd been given a responsibility he didn't deserve and couldn't afford to fail. To be someone this remarkable woman could rely on. To prove that not all men were threats. That some could be trusted to keep their word and their distance and their protection without demanding payment. When Ayanna woke for her watch shift, she found Jake still awake, still tending the fire. "You should have woken me," she said. "Couldn't sleep anyway." She studied him in the firelight. "Thank you for earlier when the dreams came." "You heard that. I'm always partially aware even when sleeping." "Survival skill." She settled beside the fire. "But hearing your voice helped. Knowing you were there, but not demanding anything, it helped." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ayanna asked, "What will you do after this is over, if we survive?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "My ranch is probably forfeit now. Can't go back there. Silas will make sure of that." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was just a place to hide. I was never really living there. Just existing. And now I'm living. For the first time in years, I'm actually engaged with the world instead of hiding from it. That's worth more than a cabin." Ayanna nodded slowly. "When this is done, when I've testified and the evidence is presented, I'll have my father's land back. The restitution from the fraud cases." She hesitated, then continued. "It's good land, near the Wyoming border. Watergrass shelter, big enough for cattle or horses, big enough for—" She trailed off. "Big enough for what?" Jake prompted gently. "Big enough for people who don't quite fit anywhere else to make a home. People who've been broken by the system and need a place to heal." She looked at him. "People like us." The offer hung in the air between them. Not quite a proposition, more a possibility. A future they might build together if they survived long enough to try. "I'd like that," Jake said quietly. "Very much." Ayanna smiled, genuine and warm, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. "Then we have one more reason to survive the next few days," she said. They talked through the rest of the night, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Ayanna told him about her childhood, about learning to track and hunt and read the land from her father, about her mother who died from cholera before the cavalry came, about siblings lost to various forms of violence and disease. Jake shared his own history, a childhood in Ohio that seemed impossibly distant and naive, parents who'd wanted better for him than farming, his decision to join the cavalry because it seemed romantic and meaningful. "We were both so young," Ayanna observed, "both so certain we knew how the world worked, and both so wrong. But we learned. That's what matters. We saw the truth and we changed." As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, they prepared to ride. The horses were rested and fed. Their supplies were organized efficiently. Jake checked his rifle, his pistol, his ammunition. Professional preparations for the violence that might come. Ayanna did the same, with movements that suggested she'd done this many times before. Survival required being armed and ready. Being a woman didn't exempt her from that necessity. "Today Silas starts hunting seriously," Jake said as they mounted up. "Then we stay ahead of him," Ayanna replied. "My route is still our best advantage. He doesn't know this country like I do." They rode out of the cave into the pale morning light. The mountains stretched around them in magnificent isolation, beautiful and unforgiving. Somewhere behind them, probably closer than comfort, allowed Silas Cord and his men were breaking camp and beginning their pursuit. Somewhere ahead in the territorial capital of Helena waited Marshal Owen Blackwell and the slim hope of justice. And between those 2 points, Jake and Ayanna would have to navigate terrain, weather, pursuit, and their own complicated histories. But as they rode higher into the mountains, following trails that existed only in Ayanna's memory and her father's teachings, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Not hiding from the past, but actively working to make the future better. Not avoiding consequences, but facing them head on. Not existing in isolation, but connecting with another human being in ways that felt both terrifying and essential. The path ahead was dangerous. The odds were poor. The outcome uncertain. But for the first time since leaving the cavalry, Jake Morrison felt like he was finally on the right side, and that was worth any price he might have to pay. Uh, Continuing in part two remainder. The second day of riding brought new challenges. The weather turned as mountain weather often did without warning. Storm clouds built from nothing, and by midday they were riding through sheets of cold rain that made visibility poor and the rocky trails treacherous. Ayana navigated with unwavering confidence, but Jake could see the toll it was taking. She was exhausted, running on will and determination rather than rest. "We need to stop," he called over the sound of rain. "Can't stop. They're getting closer." "How do you know?" She pointed to marks on the trail that Jake couldn't see through the rain. "Horse droppings, less than 3 hours old. They're pushing hard." Jake's estimation of her tracking skills rose even higher. In this weather, being able to read sign at all was impressive. Being able to age it accurately was extraordinary. "Then we need to do something unexpected," he said. Ayana pulled her horse to a stop, rain streaming down her face. "I'm listening." Jake outlined a risky plan. Instead of continuing to run, they'd set a false trail leading one direction, while actually doubling back through a hidden pass Ayana had mentioned earlier. It would put them slightly behind their pursuers, dangerous but potentially effective at throwing off the trail. Ayana considered it, factoring risks and variables with visible calculation. "It could work, but if they realize what we've done and double back too, we'd be trapped between them and Helena with no good options," Jake finished. "I know, but at this point, every choice is risky. At least this one might buy us breathing room." "All right," Ayana decided. "We try it." They spent the next hour carefully constructing a false trail using techniques Jake had learned during his cavalry days. Leading the horses through shallow water to break the track, brushing away hoof prints in softer ground, creating enough evidence of passage to be believable without being obvious. Then they backtracked carefully and took the hidden pass Ayana knew barely wide enough for the horses switchbacking through terrain that would have been invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. By the time they emerged on the other side, they were soaked, exhausted, and operating on hope more than certainty. But they were also miles from where Silas would expect them to be. As night fell, they found shelter in another of Ayana's remembered sanctuaries, a deep overhang that provided protection from the rain and enough concealment to risk a small fire. "How many places like this do you know?" Jake asked as they worked to get the fire started with damp wood. "Dozens," Ayana said. "Maybe hundreds if you count the whole territory." "My father believed in being prepared, knowing where water was, where shelter could be found, where you could defend yourself if needed. He prepared you well." "He prepared me for a world he thought would still exist," Ayana corrected. "A world where our knowledge and our presence were respected. He didn't prepare me for a world that would try to erase us completely." She finally got the fire lit, nursing the small flame carefully. But the skills translated. Knowing how to survive in the wilderness before became knowing how to survive while running from your people after. Jake heard the edge in her voice. Not quite bitterness, more like acknowledgement of painful irony. "What do you want from this?" he asked. "When we get to Helena, when you testify, when the truth comes out, what do you want the outcome to be?" Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring into the small fire. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I want people to know my father's name, Chief Tahatan. I want them to know he was murdered, not for being a threat to settlers or civilization, but for being too intelligent and too influential to allow to live. I want the world to understand that his death wasn't tragedy or accident. It was calculated assassination." She looked at Jake. "And I want every family that lost land to Whitmore schemes to get it back. Every acre, every water right, every claim. I want restitution and acknowledgement and the kind of justice that actually means something." That's a lot to ask from a broken system. "I know, but I'm tired of asking for less. I'm tired of being told to be grateful for scraps when we're owed the whole meal." Jake nodded slowly. "And Whitmore himself, what do you want for him?" "Prison upon them," Ayana said immediately. "Public trial, public sentencing, public acknowledgement of what he did. I want him to face consequences in a courtroom where his money and connections can't protect him. I want him to experience powerlessness." She paused. "My father taught me that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Revenge is personal satisfaction." Justice is systemic change. I want justice. Even though Whitmore orchestrated your father's murder, especially because of that, because if I just wanted revenge, I could have killed Whitmore years ago. I had opportunities. I chose not to take them. Her jaw set firmly. I chose to seek justice instead, to do things the right way through the right channels, even though it's harder and more dangerous and might not succeed. Jake felt humbled by her clarity of purpose. He'd spent 3 years hiding from much smaller responsibilities. She'd spent years actively pursuing justice under conditions that would have broken most people. You're extraordinary, he said quietly. I'm desperate, Ayanna corrected, and determined, and running out of options. But I appreciate the sentiment. They shared the last of their food supplies running lower than Jake liked. Tomorrow they'd need to hunt or forage, which would slow them down. As they settled in for the night, Jake noticed Ayanna pulling out her notebook again. Even exhausted, even hunted, she was still documenting, still recording. What are you writing now? He asked. This journey, she said without looking up. Dates, locations, what we've encountered. If something happens to us, if we don't make it, I want there to be a record. Proof that we tried. The implication was sobering. She was planning for failure, for the possibility that they'd die before reaching Helena. We'll make it, Jake said firmly. Maybe, maybe not. But either way, the truth should be recorded. She wrote for a while longer, her handwriting precise, even by firelight and exhaustion. Then she carefully closed the notebook and tucked it away. Jake, she said quietly, if something does happen, if I'm killed or captured and you escape, don't. Listen, she interrupted. If that happens, you take the notebook. You get it to Marshal Blackwell. You make sure my father's story is told, and Whitmore faces consequences. Promise me. Ayanna, promise me. Promise. Her eyes were fierce in the firelight. This is more important than either of us. This is about every family that was destroyed, every life that was stolen, every truth that was buried. You promise me you'll see it through. Jake met her gaze. I promise, but the same goes for you. If I fall and you can continue, I will, she said immediately. This is my quest. I'll see it through or die trying. They sat in heavy silence for a moment, both aware they'd just acknowledged the very real possibility of death. Then Ayanna did something unexpected. She reached across the small fire and took Jake's hand. Her fingers were calloused and strong, marked by years of hard work and harder survival. Thank you, she said simply, for believing me, for helping me, for choosing this path even knowing what it might cost you. Jake squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for trusting me, for letting me try to make amends, for showing me what real courage looks like. They held hands across the fire for a long moment, and Jake felt something profound shifting between them. Not quite love, too soon for that, but something deeper than simple alliance. Recognition, understanding. The connection between two people who'd both been broken by the same system and were now trying to build something better from the pieces. When Ayanna finally pulled her hand back and settled into her bedroll, Jake felt the absence like a physical thing. He took first watch again, sitting with his back to stone and his rifle across his knees, listening to the rain diminish to drizzle and then stop altogether. The clouds broke and the stars emerged cold and distant and beautiful. Somewhere in those mountains, Silas was hunting them. Somewhere ahead, Helena waited with the promise and threat of justice. Somewhere in between, Jake and Ayanna rode a knife's edge between success and disaster. But tonight in this moment, they were alive and together and still fighting. And that had to be enough. When dawn came, they discovered their gambit had worked. Using skills Jake hadn't fully exercised in years, they found and studied the trail behind them. Silas's group had indeed followed the false path, probably wouldn't realize the deception for hours yet, but they'd realize eventually. Silas was too good not to figure it out. We have a half-day lead, maybe more, Jake estimated. Then we make it count, Ayanna said. Hard riding, no stops except to rest the horses. They pushed through the third day with renewed urgency. The terrain was gradually descending now, leaving the highest peaks behind as they worked their way toward lower elevations where Helena nestled in a valley. Ayanna continued to navigate with unerring accuracy, but Jake could see the strain. She'd been running for 2 years, and this final push was drawing on reserves that were nearly depleted. Late in the afternoon, they encountered something unexpected. Riders approaching from ahead, not behind where Silas would be, but from the direction of Helena. Jake and Ayanna took cover immediately, watching from concealment as the group came into view. 5 men, official bearing, and at the front, wearing a Marshall star that caught the afternoon sun, was a tall man with gray-streaked hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in hard country. "Blackwell," Ayanna breathed. "That's Owen Blackwell. Are you sure?" "I've seen him before, from a distance years ago, but I'm sure it's in." They were still debating whether to reveal themselves when one of Blackwell's men spotted them. Rifles came up immediately and a voice called out, "Show yourselves, hands visible." Jake and Ayanna exchanged a glance. They'd come this far on faith and necessity. One more leap wasn't going to kill them. Probably. They emerged from cover, hands raised, making no threatening moves. Marshal Blackwell studied them with eyes that missed nothing. His gaze lingered on Ayanna, and Jake saw recognition flash across his face. "You're the woman," Blackwell said, not a question. "The one Whitmore's been hunting?" "Yes," Ayanna said. Her voice was steady despite the rifles pointed at them. "And you, Bone?" Blackwell turned to Jake. "Jake Morrison, 3rd Cavalry, deserted your post in 81. "I left," Jake corrected carefully. "Not quite the same thing." "No," Blackwell agreed. "It's not." He studied them both for another long moment. "Lower your weapons," he told his men. Then to Jake and Ayanna, "We need to talk, and you need to tell me what's so important that Edmund Whitmore has half the territory looking for you." "How did you know where to find us?" Ayanna asked. A slight smile crossed Blackwell's weathered face. "I didn't. I've been investigating Whitmore for 3 years. When I heard he'd put a bounty on an Apache woman carrying documents, I figured the two might be connected. So I've been riding the most likely routes from his operation toward Helena, hoping to intercept." He gestured toward a copse of trees nearby. "Let's get off the trail, and you can tell me your story. But make it quick and make it convincing. Because if what I've heard is even partially true, we're all in more danger than you know." They gathered in the shelter of the trees, and Ayanna pulled out her notebook. For the next hour, she walked Marshal Blackwell through everything, every document, every map, every piece of evidence she'd collected over 2 years of meticulous work. Blackwell listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively more grim. His men stood guard, watching all directions, clearly used to operating in hostile territory. When Ayanna finished, Blackwell sat back and let out a long breath. "This is worse than I thought," he said quietly. "I knew Whitmore was dirty. I suspected large-scale fraud. But this?" He gestured to the notebook. "This is systematic enough to implicate dozens of people, powerful people." "Can you prosecute?" Jake asked. Blackwell's expression turned cautious. "Prosecute, yes. When? That's more complicated." He looked at Ayanna directly. "You understand what you're asking for, the kind of fight this will be." "I've been preparing for it for 2 years," Ayanna said. "And you, Bone?" Blackwell turned to Jake. "Your name is in there too. You'd be willing to testify against yourself. Accept whatever consequences come." "Yes," Jake said without hesitation. Blackwell studied him. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Jake admitted. That got a bark of laughter from the marshal. "All right then, here's what happens next. We ride for Helena, fast and careful. Because the moment Whitmore learns we have his evidence, he'll do everything in his power to ensure we never reach a courtroom." "There's more," Jake said. "Silas Cord is hunting us. He's maybe 6 hours behind, maybe less." Blackwell's expression darkened. "Silas Cord? I know him. Good tracker. Better mercenary." He considered. "That changes things. We'll need to move faster than I'd like and prepare for potential confrontation." They mounted up and rode hard, Blackwell's men forming a protective perimeter around Jake and Ayanna. They pushed through the evening and into full darkness, using moonlight to navigate trails that grew progressively easier as they descended toward the valley. They were perhaps 10 miles from Helena when disaster struck. The gunshot came from nowhere, a crack in the darkness that sent everyone diving for cover. One of Blackwell's men cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder. "Ambush!" someone shouted. More shots. Multiple shooters in concealed positions. They'd been waiting, had picked the perfect spot for an attack, a narrow section of trail with limited cover and clear fields of fire. Jake dragged Ayanna behind a boulder as bullets ricocheted off stone all around them. Blackwell's men returned fire, but in the darkness, they were shooting at muzzle flashes in hope. "We're pinned," Blackwell growled, crouched beside them. "Can't advance, can't retreat without being cut down." Jake assessed their position with old cavalry tactical training. 3 men with Blackwell, 1 wounded, against at least 5 shooters in superior positions. Poor odds growing worse. Then a voice called out from the darkness, a voice Jake knew. "Morrison, I know you're there. We can end this right now. Send out the woman and the notebook, and the rest of you ride free." "Silas, don't do it," Ayanna said immediately. "Jake, don't." "I won't," Jake interrupted, "but I'm going to talk to him." He raised his voice. "Silas, you're shooting at a federal marshal. That's a hanging offense." "Only if I'm caught," Silas called back, "and only if anyone survives to testify your choice, Jake. The woman and the evidence, or everyone dies right here." Blackwell's jaw clenched. "I don't negotiate with criminals." "He's not bluffing," Jake said. "Silas will kill all of us if that's what it takes to complete his contract." "Then we fight," Blackwell said grimly. But Ayanna was looking at Jake with an expression he'd learned to recognize. She was calculating, measuring odds, considering options. "No," Jake said, reading her intention. "Absolutely not. It's the only way we don't sacrifice you to save ourselves." "It's not sacrifice," Ayanna argued. "It's strategy. If I surrender, he gets what he wants. The shooting stops. And then he kills you and destroys the evidence," Jake finished. "Unless we plan for that," Ayanna said. She pulled the notebook from inside her shirt and pressed it into Jake's hands. "You take this. You and Blackwell ride for Helena. I'll buy you time." "No." "Jake." I said no. His voice was harsh with fear and determination. "We don't leave people behind. We don't sacrifice the person who matters most to save ourselves. We find another way." "There is no other way," Ayanna said softly. "You know there isn't." For a long moment, they stared at each other in the darkness, the sound of gunfire continuing around them. Jake saw in her eyes the same determination that had kept her alive for 2 years, the same refusal to give up or give in. And he saw something else, the quiet acceptance that this might be how her story ended. But he couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that. "I have an idea," he said suddenly. "It's risky, probably suicidal, but it's better than surrender." He outlined the plan quickly. Blackwell listened with growing incredulity. "That's not probably suicidal," the marshal said. "That's definitely suicidal. Do you have a better option?" Blackwell grimaced. "No." "Then we try it." What happened next would later be described in various conflicting accounts by the survivors. But the basic elements remained consistent across all tellings. Jake Morrison stood up in full view of the shooters, hands raised, and walked towards Silas Cord's position. "Don't shoot," he called. "I'm coming to talk. No weapons." The firing stopped. Confused silence fell over the battlefield. Silas emerged from cover, rifle trained on Jake. In the moonlight, Jake could see his former friend's face, hard, determined, but also questioning. "What are you doing, Jake?" "Ending this," Jake said. "You want the notebook, and you can have it, but you let everyone else go first. They ride for Helena, then I hand it over." "That's not how this works." "That's exactly how this works," Jake interrupted. "You've got me, your old partner, the man you've been hunting just as hard as her. I'm worth more to you than she is, Silas, because killing me would hurt worse than any contract payment." Silas's face twisted with emotion. "You think I want to kill you?" "I think you want to complete your trump," Jake said, "and I think you're hurt and angry enough to do it even if it destroys you. But I also think there's enough of my old friend left in there to honor a deal." "What deal?" "They ride out, all of them. You let them go. Once they're clear, I give you the notebook, and you can do whatever you want with me." "Jake, no!" Ayanna's voice came from behind him. But Jake didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked on Silas. "Well, do we have a deal?" Silas stood frozen, clearly warring with himself. The contract, the money, the orders from Whitmore, all of it against years of brotherhood and the ghost of who they had once been. "The marshal gets 1 hour head start," Silas finally said. "Then I pursue. If he's still in the territory, he's fair game." "No pursuit," Jake countered. "They get safe passage all the way to Helena." Not happening. 1 hour. Take it or we finish this fight right now. Jake calculated quickly. An hour might be enough if they rode hard. It would have to be. Deal. Jake Morrison, I swear to God. Blackwell started. Marshall. Jake cut him off. Honor the deal. Get Ayanna to Helena. Make sure her testimony is heard. Make sure the evidence is presented. That's all that matters. He could feel Ayanna's eyes boring into his back, could sense her fury and grief and desperate calculation as she tried to find a way to refuse. Go, Jake said quietly. Please trust me one more time. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then he heard Blackwell giving orders, heard horses being gathered, heard Ayanna's voice thick with emotion saying words he couldn't quite make out, heard them right away. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Jake turned back to Silas. They stood facing each other in the moonlight, two former brothers now on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. You're a fool, Silas said quietly. You know I can't let you live. I know, Jake replied, but I also know you'll honor the hour, and that's all I need. For what? Jake smiled grimly. For them to get away, for the evidence to reach Helena, for justice to have a chance. He paused. And for you to have to live with the fact that you killed your best friend for money. Silas flinched as if struck. Don't. I'm not trying to hurt you, Silas. I'm trying to make you see what you've become. The man I knew, the man I served with wouldn't have taken this job, wouldn't have chosen money over righteousness. Righteousness, Silas's voice rose. You lecture me about righteousness. You who abandoned everything we built, who walked away from your brothers. I walked away from a system that was destroying people, Jake said. There's a difference. No, there isn't. Silas raised his rifle. The notebook. Now. Jake reached into his shirt and pulled out. Nothing. Silas's eyes widened. You didn't. Of course I didn't bring it, Jake said calmly. Ayanna has it. She's riding for Helena right now. And by the time your hour is up and you start pursuing, she'll have enough of a lead that even you won't catch her in time. Silas's face went through a series of expressions, shock, rage, admiration, fury, all cycling rapidly. You played me, he said quietly. I gave you a choice, Jake corrected, between money and friendship. You chose money, I chose friendship, and now we both live with those choices. For a moment, Jake thought Silas might shoot him right there. The rifle was trained on his chest. Silas's finger was on the trigger. One twitch and it would be over. But then Silas lowered the weapon. Go. What? Go, ride for Helena. Catch up with them. Silas's voice was hollow. I can't. I won't. He turned away. You have 10 minutes. Then I report back to Whitmore that you all escaped. Then I'm done. No more hunting. No more contracts. I'm done with all but of it. Jake felt something break and heal simultaneously in his chest. Silas. Go, Jake, before I change my mind. Before I remember that I'm supposed to be the villain in this story. Jake wanted to say something profound, something that would fix years of damage and bridge the gap between them. But words felt inadequate. So he simply said, Thank you, brother. Then he ran for his horse and rode hard for Helena. Behind him, Silas Cord stood alone in the moonlight, surrounded by his hired men who waited for orders that wouldn't come. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry for the friendship he'd destroyed and the man he'd become. Continuing the final portion, part 2. Jake caught up with Blackwell's group. An hour later, his horse lathered and blowing from the hard ride. Ayanna saw him first. She wheeled her horse around and rode back to meet him, and Jake saw tears streaming down her face, tears she'd clearly been trying to hide. You stubborn, impossible, idiotic man, she said. And then she was hugging him, arms wrapped tight around him, despite both of them being on horseback. I'm okay, Jake said. We're okay. Silas, let us go. What happened? Blackwell demanded. Jake explained quickly as they rode. The standoff, the bluff, Silas's final choice. He let you live, Ayanna said wonderingly. After everything, he chose mercy. He chose friendship, Jake corrected, or the memory of it anyway. That was enough. They rode through the rest of the night and reached Helena as the sun was rising over the eastern mountains. The territorial capital was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, early merchants opening their shops. To Jake and Ayanna, it looked like the most beautiful place in the world. Marshal Blackwell led them directly to the courthouse, where he had allies and secure facilities. Within hours, Ayana's evidence was being examined by prosecutors. Her testimony was being recorded. The machinery of justice, slow and imperfect but real, was beginning to turn. Jake and Ayana sat in Blackwell's office, exhausted beyond measure, barely able to believe they had actually made it. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now we build the case," Blackwell said. "It'll take time, months probably. We'll need to verify documents, interview witnesses, gather additional evidence." He looked at Ayana. "And you'll need to testify. Multiple times, in detail. They'll try to break you." "I know," Ayana said. "I'm ready." "And you," Blackwell turned to Jake, "your involvement will come out. Your name in those documents. You understand you might face charges too." "I understand," Jake said. "I'll face whatever comes." Blackwell nodded slowly. "All right then. For now, I'm placing you both in protective custody. Whitmore will try something. Count on it. But here in Helena, under federal jurisdiction, he'll find it harder to operate." As they were being shown to secure rooms in the courthouse building, Ayana pulled Jake aside. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything, for believing me, for protecting me, for being willing to sacrifice yourself." "I didn't sacrifice anything," Jake said. "I gained everything, purpose, redemption, and—" He hesitated. "And what?" Ayana prompted gently. "And you," Jake finished. "I gained you, your trust, your friendship, the chance to stand beside someone truly remarkable." Ayana's eyes glistened. "When this is over, when we've testified and fought and survived whatever comes next, I meant what I said about the land, about building something new." "So did I." "Then we have something to fight for," Ayana said. She touched his face gently. "Something worth surviving for." Jake covered her hand with his own. "Together." "Together," Ayana confirmed. And in that moment, exhausted and hunted and facing an uncertain future, they both felt something that had been missing for years. Hope. Real, solid, tangible hope that the future might actually be better than the past. That justice, however imperfect, was possible. That change, however difficult, was achievable. And that two broken people could help heal each other while fighting to heal a broken system. The path ahead was still dangerous. The fight was far from over, but they would face it together. And that made all the difference. The weeks that followed their arrival in Helena were a strange combination of tedious waiting and constant tension. Ayana spent her days with prosecutors going over every page of evidence, every notation in her notebook, every memory of her time working for Whitmore. She answered the same questions dozens of times each, telling, draining her a little more, but also strengthening the case they were building. Jake was interviewed repeatedly as well, though his role was more complicated. He was simultaneously witness corroborator and potential defendant. The prosecutors made it clear that his cooperation would be considered during any proceedings against him, but no promises were made. He accepted this. Consequences, after all, were what he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Marshall Blackwell proved to be exactly what his reputation suggested: honest, thorough, and absolutely unwilling to be intimidated. When Whitmore's lawyers appeared demanding Ayana's arrest for theft and Jake's for harboring a fugitive, Blackwell showed them documentation of federal protection and suggested they leave before he arrested them for obstruction. But the pressure was building from multiple directions. Local newspapers ran stories, some supporting the investigation, others questioning whether a savage's testimony could be trusted. Political allies of Whitmore's called for Blackwell's removal. Anonymous threats arrived at the courthouse daily. Through it all, Ayana remained steady. Jake watched her transform before his eyes from a hunted woman hiding her capabilities to someone who stood tall and spoke clearly, refusing to be diminished. One evening, about 3 weeks after their arrival, Jake found her standing at the window of her secured room, staring out at the Montana mountains visible in the distance. "Thinking about running?" he asked gently. She smiled without turning. "Always. Old habits." Then she did turn, and her expression was serious. "But no, not anymore. I'm tired of running, tired of hiding. I want to stand still and make them come to me." "They will," Jake warned, "when the trial starts." "I know." Ayana moved away from the window and sat at the small desk where she'd been reviewing testimony. "Blackwell warned me. They'll attack my character, my intelligence, my honesty. They'll call me a liar and a thief. They'll try to make the jury believe I fabricated everything out of spite or madness. How do you prepare for that? By remembering why I'm doing this, by holding on to the truth even when they try to bury it under lies. She looked at Jake. And by knowing I'm not alone, that there are people who believe me. Jake crossed the room and took her hand. It had become natural between them, these small gestures of support and connection. They hadn't spoken about what was growing between them. There hadn't been time or space for romance with everything else happening, but it was there, undeniable and deepening. Always, he said simply, I'll always believe you. Ayana squeezed his hand. Even when it costs you, Tom, especially then. They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, drawing strength from each other. Then a knock at the door broke the moment. Blackwell entered, his expression grave. We have a development, he said. You both need to hear this. They followed him to his office where a woman sat waiting. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, in a style that spoke of money and social position. Her face was composed, but Jake could see the strain beneath the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. This is Margaret Whitmore, Blackwell said. Edmund Whitmore's wife. Ayana stiffened beside Jake, her hand moving instinctively toward a weapon she wasn't carrying. It's all right, Blackwell said quickly. She came here voluntarily. She has information. Margaret Whitmore studied Ayana with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition. I've seen you before, Margaret said quietly. Years ago, you worked in my husband's office. He told me you were simple, couldn't understand English well. I believed him. I understood everything, Ayana said, her voice carefully controlled. I know that now. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. I should have known it then. Should have questioned why Edmund was so dismissive of you. But she faltered. I chose not to see. It was easier that way. Why are you here, Mrs. Whitmore? Jake asked. Margaret looked at Blackwell, who nodded encouragingly. She took a breath and began to speak. I've known about Edmund's activities for years. Not the details, but enough. The late-night meetings, the unexplained money. The way he talked about certain people, indigenous families, small ranchers, anyone who got in his way like they were obstacles rather than human beings. She paused, gathering strength. I told myself I was being a good wife, loyal, supportive, that it wasn't my place to question or interfere. But then I heard Edmund talking with his associates about you. She looked at Ayana, about how you'd escaped, about the hunt, about what he planned to do when you were caught. Margaret's voice dropped. He was laughing, joking about it, and I realized I'd married a monster. Worse, I'd been protecting that monster through my silence. What changed? Ayana asked. Her voice was hard but not cruel. My son, Margaret said simply. He's 17, idealistic. He asked me what I believed and what I stood for, and I couldn't answer him because I've stood for nothing except maintaining comfort and status. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather portfolio. These are documents from Edmund's private files, communications with corrupt officials, financial records showing bribes, contracts for services that were never rendered but paid for anyway. It's not everything, but it corroborates what you've already presented. Blackwell took the portfolio carefully, already flipping through pages. His eyebrows rose as he read. This is Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand what you're doing? Your husband will be ruined. You'll lose everything. I've already lost everything that matters, Margaret said. My integrity, my self-respect, the ability to look my son in the eye. She turned to Ayana. I can't undo what Edmund did, can't bring back the people he hurt, but I can help ensure he faces consequences. Ayana stared at her for a long moment. Jake could see the war happening behind her eyes, the desire for justice against the suspicion that this might be some elaborate trap. Why should I trust you? Ayana finally asked. You've protected him for years. Why betray him now? Because I heard you, Margaret said. Your testimony. The prosecutor shared it with me, trying to convince me to cooperate, and I heard the truth in every word. The pain, the strength, the refusal to be silenced. Tears welled in her eyes, and I was ashamed, deeply, profoundly ashamed. Because I had a voice, I had power. I had the ability to speak up, and I chose silence. While you, with nothing and no one, chose to speak despite knowing it might kill you. She wiped her eyes. Your courage shamed me into finding my own. It's not much. Too late by years. But it's what I have to offer. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Ayanna spoke, her voice softer than before. Thank you for coming forward, for choosing truth over comfort. Margaret nodded, relief visible in her posture. There's one more thing, she said to Blackwell. Edmund knows I've come here. He'll retaliate. Against me, against my son, against anyone who's helped me. You need to provide protection. Already arranged, Blackwell said. You and your son will be placed in protective custody until the trial concludes. As Margaret was led away by deputies, Jake turned to Ayanna. That changes things. Everything, Ayanna agreed. With her testimony and documents, the case becomes almost unbeatable. Which makes Whitmore more dangerous, Blackwell warned. A cornered animal is the most violent. Expect him to try something desperate. The marshal proved prophetic. 2 days later, as Jake was returning to the courthouse from a brief supervised walk, someone stepped out of an alley. It was Silas. Jake's hand moved to his pistol, but Silas raised his hands immediately. I'm not here to fight. Then why are you here? To warn you. Silas looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. Whitmore hired new men, not trackers this time, killers. They're planning to hit the courthouse during the trial, create chaos, assassinate key witnesses. How do you know this? Because they tried to hire me first, Silas said bitterly. When I refused, they made it clear I could join them or stay out of the way. I chose to come warn you instead. Jake studied his former friend. Silas looked broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. The weight of his choices had clearly caught up with him. Why the change of heart? Jake asked quietly. You were right, Silas said. About what I'd become, about the man I used to be. He looked away. I've spent 3 weeks thinking about what you said, about killing my best friend for money. And I realized I'd already killed him. Killed the man I used to be. Killed the brotherhood we had. All for a paycheck and the illusion that I was on the right side. Silas, let me finish, Silas interrupted. I can't undo what I've done. Can't bring back the people I've hunted or hurt. But I can try to prevent more harm. So I'm here, telling you what's coming, and offering to help stop it. Jake made a decision. Come with me. Tell Blackwell everything. Silas hesitated. I'll be arrested for everything I've done. Probably, Jake agreed, but you'll also be doing the right thing. Finally. For a moment, Silas looked like he might run. Then his shoulders squared. All right, let's go face the music. Blackwell listened to Silas's intelligence with growing alarm. Then he mobilized. Federal marshals were brought in from neighboring territories. The courthouse was fortified. Security protocols were implemented for the trial. And Silas, after giving his full confession and cooperation, was placed in a cell, not comfortable, but not the harsh treatment he'd probably expected either. He's trying, Jake told Ayanna when she questioned why Silas was being treated relatively well. Redemption has to start somewhere. Even for people who hunted us. Especially for them, Jake said. If Silas can change, if he can choose different, it means change is possible. And we need to believe that's true. Ayanna considered this. Your capacity for forgiveness amazes me. Not forgiveness, Jake corrected. Forgiveness is for the person wrong to give. You're the one who'd need to forgive Silas, not me. I'm just allowing for the possibility of redemption, which is different. Is it? I hope so, because I'm counting on redemption being possible for me too. The trial began on a cold November morning. The courtroom was packed with the spectators, journalists, and observers from across the territory. The judge was a federal appointee known for fairness, but also for running a strict courtroom. No dramatics, no political grandstanding, just evidence and law. Edmund Whitmore sat at the defense table looking confident and composed. His lawyers were the best money could buy, sharp and aggressive and prepared to fight every point. Ayanna sat in the witness area wearing a simple but dignified dress that Margaret Whitmore had quietly provided. She looked small in the formal setting, but when she met Whitmore's eyes across the courtroom, she didn't flinch. Jake sat in the gallery there to support but unable to help directly. He watched as the prosecution laid out their case document by document, testimony by testimony, building a picture of systematic fraud and violence. The defense attacked immediately and viciously. They questioned the authenticity of Ayanna's documentation, suggested she'd fabricated evidence, implied she was motivated by revenge rather than truth, painted her as a vindictive woman, scorned a criminal trying to destroy an honest businessman. Through it all, Ayanna remained calm. She answered every question clearly, provided context for every document, refused to be rattled or provoked. But Jake could see the toll it was taking. Each day in court drained her a little more. Each attack on her character, her intelligence, her honesty, was a wound that bled invisibly. On the fourth day of trial, the defense made their mistake. One of Whitmore's lawyers, a sharp-tongued man named Carlisle, was cross-examining Ayanna about her time working for Whitmore. "Isn't it true," Carlisle asked with barely concealed contempt, "that you were purchased as property, that you were owned?" The courtroom went silent. Even the judge looked taken aback by the bluntness of the question. Ayanna met Carlisle's eyes without wavering. "Yes. And isn't it also true that property doesn't have the right to testify against its owner?" The prosecution objected immediately, and the judge sustained it. But the damage was done, or so Carlisle thought. Instead, Ayanna turned to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge looked surprised but nodded. "You may." Ayanna stood and Jake felt his heart clench at the dignity in her posture. "Mr. Carlisle is correct that I was bought and sold like property," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "But he's wrong about what that means. Because even while I was being treated as less than human, I remained human. I could think. I could learn. I could document truth." She gestured to the evidence on the prosecutor's table. "Those documents aren't fabricated. They're copied from Mr. Whitmore's own files. Every date, every name, every transaction. I recorded them precisely because I knew that one day someone might actually listen." Her gaze swept the courtroom. "Mr. Carlisle wants you to believe that being treated as property makes me unreliable. I suggest the opposite is true. Being treated as furniture made me invisible. And being invisible gave me access to conversations and documents that Mr. Whitmore never would have allowed if he'd seen me as a person capable of understanding and remembering." She turned to look directly at Whitmore. "He underestimated me. He assumed that because he could buy my labor, he could silence my truth. He was wrong." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, and Jake saw something shift in the jury's faces, a movement from skepticism toward belief. Ayanna had turned the defense's attack into her strongest moment. The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Margaret Whitmore testified about her husband's private conversations and hidden documents. Her testimony was devastating, made more so by the obvious pain it caused her to betray her husband publicly. Other witnesses came forward, families who'd lost land surveyors, who'd been pressured to falsify reports, officials who'd been bribed or threatened. The web of corruption was laid bare, and Whitmore sat at the center of it. Jake testified about his escort duties in 1876, about what he'd seen and what he'd failed to see, about the ways the cavalry had been used as cover for criminal activity. His testimony implicated himself as much as anyone, and he accepted that without flinching. The defense tried to discredit him as a deserter and traitor, but Jake's honesty about his own failures actually strengthened his credibility. Finally, the prosecution presented their evidence about Chief Tahoughton's assassination. Documents showing payments to mercenaries. Testimony from one of those mercenaries who'd been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. A detailed timeline that showed Whitmore orchestrating murder to eliminate a threat to his land schemes. When the evidence was presented, the courtroom was utterly silent. Even Whitmore's lawyers seemed shaken. On the final day of testimony, something unexpected happened. A letter was presented to the court. It had been found hidden in the lining of Ayanna's notebook during evidence processing, so carefully concealed that even she hadn't known it was there. It was written in careful English on aged paper dated June 5, 1876, 2 days before Chief Tahoughton's murder. The judge read it aloud. "To whoever finds this letter, if you are reading these words, it means I am dead, and my daughter Ayanna has survived long enough to bring truth to light. I am Chief Tahoughton of the Niitsitapi people. I write this knowing that Edmund Whitmore has ordered my death. He believes killing me will allow him to seize our lands unopposed. He is wrong. My daughter carries my knowledge and my strength. She is smarter than Whitmore realizes, braver than he can imagine. She will survive. She will document. She will speak truth. To whoever finds this, my daughter is not asking for revenge. She asks only for justice, for acknowledgement that our lives and our losses are real, for the truth to be told and heard. Protect her not because she is Apache, not because she is my daughter, but because she represents what we all could be: strong enough to survive, brave enough to speak, wise enough to seek justice rather than vengeance. She is the future I dreamed of. Honor her courage by listening to her truth. Chief Tahatan. By the time the judge finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the defense lawyers looked moved. Ayanna sat, frozen, tears streaming down her face. She had known her father was gone, had grieved him for years. But to hear his words, to know he'd been thinking of her in his final days, believing in her even then, it broke something in her and healed something simultaneously. After the letter, the defense's case crumbled. Whitmore's lawyers tried to recover, tried to cast doubt, but the combination of documentary evidence, multiple testimonies, Margaret's betrayal, and now Chief Tahatan's prophetic letter was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all major charges: fraud, conspiracy, accessory to murder. Edmund Whitmore would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The courtroom erupted in chaos, cheers from some quarters, outrage from others. Whitmore himself sat frozen, unable to comprehend that he'd actually lost. Jake found Ayanna outside the courtroom, surrounded by well-wishers and journalists. He pushed through the crowd and reached her, and she turned and fell into his arms, shaking with emotion. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Jake corrected. "Your courage, your evidence, your refusal to give up." "Our victory," Ayanna insisted. "We did this together." They stood holding each other while the world celebrated around them, two people who'd fought impossible odds and somehow won. But the fight wasn't over. The prosecution against Jake was still pending. While his cooperation had been noted, he'd still admitted to actions that might constitute crimes. 3 days after Whitmore's conviction, Jake stood before a different judge for his own hearing. The prosecutor laid out the case. Jake had escorted surveying teams that facilitated fraud. He'd been part of the system that enabled Whitmore's crimes. While he hadn't known the full extent, he'd still participated. Jake didn't deny any of it. He pleaded guilty to charges of unwitting participation and dereliction of duty for failing to question or report suspicious activities. Then Ayanna testified, not about Jake's crimes, but about his redemption, about the man who'd protected her at great personal cost, who'd risked everything to ensure justice was served, who'd been willing to face consequences rather than hide from them. Jake Morrison was part of a broken system, Ayanna told the judge, but he recognized it was broken. He walked away. And when given the chance to help fix it, he didn't hesitate, even knowing it might destroy him. She paused. Punishment is necessary, but so is recognition of genuine change. Jake has changed. He's spent 3 years trying to atone. And when I needed him most, he chose justice over safety. Marshall Blackwell testified similarly. So did Margaret Whitmore. Even Silas Cord from his own cell provided a written statement about Jake's character and his efforts to do right. The judge listened to everything. Then he delivered his ruling. "Mr. Morrison, you participated in activities that caused real harm, even if unknowingly. That cannot be ignored. However, your subsequent actions, leaving service, refusing to continue participation, protecting a witness at great personal risk, and cooperating fully with this investigation, demonstrate genuine remorse and reformation." He paused. "Therefore, I sentence you to time served and 5 years probation. During this time, you will perform community service, working with displaced families to help them navigate land restitution claims. You will use your knowledge of the system to help undo some of the damage that system caused." Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. Not prison, not ruin. A chance to actively work toward redemption. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As he left the courtroom, Ayanna was waiting. She took his hand without a word, and they walked out into the November sunshine together. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful. Land restitution began across the territory. Families started returning to ancestral lands. The scope of Whitmore's fraud meant the process would take years, but it was happening. Ayanna was offered compensation for her suffering and her work in bringing the case. She accepted enough to be comfortable and donated the rest to establishing a legal aid fund for indigenous families navigating land claims. Margaret Whitmore quietly divorced her imprisoned husband and moved east with her son seeking a fresh start far from the scandal. Silas Cord was convicted of lesser charges related to his tracking work, but given a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony and cooperation. He would serve 2 years, then be released on probation. Jake began his community service work, discovering that helping families reclaim their land was more satisfying than anything he'd done in his cavalry years. And through it all, Jake and Ayanna grew closer. 3 months after the trial ended on a clear February morning, they rode out to the land that had been restored to Ayanna, her father's tribal territory near the Wyoming border. It was beautiful country, rolling grassland giving way to forested hills with a creek cutting through that ran year-round. Rich soil, good water, space enough for cattle or horses or whatever they chose to build. They stood on a rise overlooking the valley, and Jake felt Ayanna's hand slip into his. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it's perfect," Jake said honestly. "I think your father would be proud to see you standing, reclaiming not just land but dignity and justice." "I meant, what do you think about building something here? Together?" Ayanna turned to face him. "A ranch, yes, but also more than that. A place where people who don't fit anywhere else can find community. Where the system's broken pieces can maybe start healing." Jake understood what she was really asking. Not just about land or plans, but about a future. Together. "I think," he said carefully, "that I can't imagine anything I'd want more. But Ayanna, you should know. I love you. Have for a while now. And if we do this, if we build this life together, it won't be as business partners or friends. It will be as—" She kissed him. Gentle but firm, silencing his careful words with the simplest possible answer. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ayanna smiled. "I love you too. Have since you walked out of that barn and gave me space to feel safe. Since you believed me when no one else would. Since you were willing to die so I could seek justice." "That's a pretty low bar for love," Jake said, trying to lighten the moment. "No," Ayanna corrected seriously. "That's exactly what love should be. Someone who sees you at your most vulnerable and chooses protection over exploitation. Someone who believes your worth even when the world denies it. Someone who stands beside you even when it costs everything." She touched his face gently. "You're that person for me, and I'd like to be that person for you, if you'll have me." "Always," Jake said, "for as long as you'll tolerate me." "Then we build," Ayanna said. "Together, a ranch and a home and a future that doesn't repeat the past's mistakes." They spent the rest of the day planning where the house would go, where the barn and corrals, how they'd manage the land sustainably, what kind of community they wanted to foster. As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, they sat together on the hillside and talked about the future with a hope neither had felt in years. "What would your father think?" Jake asked quietly. "About us? About this?" Ayanna was silent for a moment, considering. "I think he'd say that justice without healing is incomplete, that we fought for truth and now we have to fight for something to grow in the space that truth created." She leaned against Jake's shoulder. "I think he'd approve. Of you. Of us. Of choosing to build rather than to destroy." "I hope so," Jake said. "I hope I can live up to what he saw in you, what he knew you'd become." "We'll do it together," Ayanna said simply. "That's the whole point. Neither of us has to carry this alone anymore." As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast Montana sky, they made their way back to Helena. But they carried with them the first seeds of something new, something hopeful, a future built on truth and justice, and the hard-won knowledge that redemption was possible if you were willing to face your past and work towards something better. 6 months later, the house was built. It wasn't grand, a simple timber structure with a wide porch and windows that caught both sunrise and sunset. But it was solid and warm in theirs. The barn followed, then corrals for the horses they were beginning to acquire. Jake discovered he had a talent for training difficult animals. His patience and gentle persistence, perfect for working with horses others had given up on. Ayanna managed the land with the same precision she'd brought to documenting Whitmore's crimes. She knew every water source, every sheltered valley, every grazing area. Under her stewardship, the land thrived. And slowly, carefully, word spread. A family displaced by the fraud trials came asking if they could camp on the property while their own land claim was processed. Jake and Ayanna said yes. A young Apache man struggling to find work in a territory that didn't trust his people asked for employment. They hired him immediately. A widow whose ranch had been stolen and then partially restored needed help rebuilding. They organized a community effort bringing together people from different backgrounds to work toward a common goal. The ranch became more than property. It became a symbol, a place where the territory's broken pieces could begin fitting together differently. Not perfectly, not without struggle or conflict or hard conversations about race and history and justice. But honestly, with intention, with the belief that change was possible. One evening in late summer, Jake and Ayanna sat on their porch watching the sunset. They'd been married for 3 months now, a small ceremony with Blackwell officiating and a mix of people neither would have imagined being in the same room a year before. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked. "Giving up your isolation, taking on all this complexity?" Jake considered the question seriously. Their ranch had become a community hub. There were always people around, always needs to be met, always complications to navigate. "Not once," he said finally. "Isolation was safe, but it wasn't living. This," he gestured to the land, the house, the people visible in the distance working on various projects. "This is living, messy and complicated and sometimes frustrating, but alive." Ayanna nodded. "I used to dream of being invisible, of finding a place where no one would notice me or hurt me, where I could just disappear. And now I understand that being seen is actually the gift, being known, being valued not despite who I am, but because of it." She took Jake's hand. "You taught me that, by seeing me when I was trying to be invisible, by valuing my truth when I was certain no one cared." "You taught me something too," Jake said, "that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about using what you learn from your mistakes to build something better. You can't undo harm, but you can choose to do good going forward." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. A rider appeared on the ridge, one of their ranch hands returning from checking fences. He waved and they waved back. Normal, domestic, peaceful. The things neither of them had ever thought they'd have. "The territorial governor is coming next week," Ayanna said. "Wants to tour the ranch. Talk about our model for reconciliation or some such political language." Jake groaned. "Do we have to?" "Unfortunately, Blackwell says it's important for the larger effort. Show that cooperation and community building are possible." She smiled. "Besides, imagine Whitmore hearing from his cell that a governor is praising the woman he tried to silence." "That does have appeal," Jake admitted. "Speaking of Whitmore," Ayanna pulled a letter from her pocket. "This arrived today, from Margaret. She thought I should know." Jake read the brief note. Whitmore had died in prison. Heart failure. Quick and without suffering. "How do you feel about that?" he asked carefully. Ayanna stared out at the darkening landscape. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, or satisfied. Some sense of justice completed." She paused. "But I just feel tired. He's dead. He faced some consequences. But nothing brings back my father or the others who died. Nothing undoes the years of pain." "No," Jake agreed quietly. "It doesn't. But this does, Ayanna said, gesturing to their ranch, their life, their community. Building something positive from the wreckage. Creating spaces where people can heal and grow and be valued. That feels like honoring my father's memory better than Whitmore's death ever could." Jake pulled her close and they sat together as full darkness fell and stars emerged. In the distance, they could hear voices, people gathering for dinner in the communal space they'd built. Laughter and conversation in multiple languages. Different traditions, learning to coexist and even celebrate each other. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still old prejudices, and new conflicts to navigate. The territory was still deeply unjust in many ways. The work of true reconciliation would take generations, but it was a start, and sometimes a start was enough. I love you, Jake said into the darkness. I love you too, Ayanna replied. Thank you for listening when no one else would, for believing when belief cost everything, for standing with me even when the path was unclear. Thank you for trusting me with your truth, for showing me what real courage looks like, for choosing to build rather than destroy, even when destruction would have been justified. They kissed gentle and deep a affirmation of everything they'd fought for and everything they'd built. When they finally pulled apart and headed inside, they walked past the mantel where Ayanna's notebook sat in a place of honor. Beside it was her father's letter framed and preserved. The evidence that had nearly gotten them both killed now rested peacefully in a home built on the land it had helped restore. And on the first page of the notebook, in Ayanna's careful handwriting, were new entries: Ayanna Morrison, free woman, survivor, wife, builder of futures; Jake Morrison, redeemed, partner, husband, seeker of justice. Together we honor the past by building something better. Together we prove that change is possible. Together we create the future, Chief. Tahatan dreamed of where truth matters. Justice prevails and love transforms the hardest soil into ground where new things can grow. The notebook's work wasn't done. Ayanna still documented, but now she recorded building rather than destruction, healing rather than harm, the slow, difficult work of creating something better from the ruins of what had been. And every entry was a testament to the power of truth, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative force of two people choosing to stand together against a world that had tried to break them both. They had gone to battle carrying nothing but truth and hope, and they had won. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to prove that one person's courage could spark change. Enough to show that the system could be challenged and sometimes beaten. Enough to demonstrate that love could grow in the spaces between justice and mercy. And enough to build a future worth fighting for. As Jake and Ayanna Morrison fell asleep that night in the home they'd built together on land restored through courage and sacrifice, they dreamed not of the past but of the future. A future where their story would inspire others to speak their truth, where their ranch would be a model for what reconciliation could look like, where their love would stand as proof that the deepest wounds could heal if tended with patience and care. They had been broken by a cruel system, but they had chosen to heal each other, and in doing so had begun healing the world around them. And that was worth more than any vengeance could ever be. Thank you for joining us on Jake and Ayanna's incredible journey from silence to voice, from guilt to redemption, from strangers to partners, building a future together. If this story of courage, justice, and transformative love moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of survival and hope. Their story reminds us that we're not defined by our worst moments, but by what we choose to do after them. That one person's courage to speak truth can spark change that ripples across generations. That redemption is possible if we're willing to face our past and work towards something better. And that love built on respect, trust, and shared purpose is stronger than any force that tries to break it. Drop a comment below and tell us, what moment touched you most? Was it Ayanna refusing to stay silent? Jake choosing justice over safety? Silas finding his way back to honor? Or Margaret discovering the courage to speak truth? Remember, your voice matters. Your truth deserves to be heard. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up and refuse to be silenced, no matter the cost. Until next time, stay brave, stay honest, and never underestimate the power of standing together for what's right.